Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to welcome our next guest. He's the human Rolodex in the venture capital industry. He was the founding CEO of LocalResponse. He's a serial entrepreneur turned venture capitalist, founder of Eniac Ventures, and had invested in amazing startups like Admob, Swiftkey, Tala, Tapad, and Uber. His wife is a renowned activist, Reshma, founder of Girls Who Code. Super excited to welcome him today. Welcome to SheVC. I'm your founder and host, Gayatri Sarkar. Today's an amazing day. We have Nihal Mehta, founder of Eniac Ventures with us. Super excited to have you, Nihal, here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Nihal is very well known in the venture capital industry as an entrepreneur investor friend, and he calls himself a human Rolodex. So I definitely want to ask Nihal that Nihal had such an amazing journey in the venture capital industry, being a serial entrepreneur. And, you know, it's always said that VC is a very hard industry to prepare for, but you went to Ivy League school, you have a computer science background, you founded multiple startups. You have a very traditional journey, but how did you become a very non-traditional VC who is so well known in the industry and so well respected?
Well, thank you for the kind words. I don't call myself a human Rolodex, fortunately. Other people do, I guess. Most people don't even know what a Rolodex is these days, so which they shouldn't. But I never wanted to be a VC growing up, and in fact, even after undergrad, building startups, meeting a VC was not a pleasurable experience, and it's still kind of cringe a little bit when I hear the words VC. Right, as a founder, you are, you're always a little bit wary, So anyway, I think of myself and my partners think of themselves as entrepreneurs first, because, we built a bunch of startups, a bunch of them failed. We have the scar tissue and muscle memory to prove it. And Eniac is a startup, so entrepreneur first. And we're lucky to be able to meet founders all day long. And the ones that, we have an opportunity to work with as an investor, we feel like we're entrepreneurs with them. We feel like we're their co-founders, without the title and the equity in some cases. And so, yeah, I still don't consider myself a VC. We're entrepreneurs and investors of lucky to be investors of incredible entrepreneurs.
No, that's great. But tell us about your secret, how you're called the human Rolodex in the venture capital industry.
Yeah, if I told you, I'd have to kill you, because it's a no. There's just a bunch of things that I've picked up, over the past kind of couple decades, in terms of just building your network. And I think we have a coach at Eniac actually, and she says, I am, my Myers-Briggs is obviously, you can tell I'm an extrovert, not an introvert, but it is such that I derive energy from other people, and naturally just making connections. And probably now on a daily basis, I'd say anywhere from 10 to 12 connections that I facilitate. I consider myself kind of like a human router at this point. And it certainly took the first decade of building companies in my career to kind of build a baseline of people that that you've worked with. And by the way, you learn the most and you meet the most people from your failures. And I've just more or less had a good sense to keep in touch with almost everybody. Whether it's a newsletter that we send once a month or once a quarter that kind of catches everybody. You're probably on one of our newsletters, either my wife's newsletter or our political newsletter or Eniac's newsletter. Another thing that I've been very conscious of is, when I meet interesting people, they usually fall into a list that I have on my computer. It's in the cloud. My partners call it the matrix, and the matrix has, you know, dozens, maybe hundreds of different lists that basically sort incredible people, you know, in different arenas. And so that's part of CRM. So for example, I have my favorite New York City seed investors, or I have my favorite national fintech investors, or I have my top brand relationships at the Fortune 500 companies, or I have my top tech media journalists, for example. So those lists are easily accessible and very easy to update and edit. And I try to activate those lists all the time. So anyway, fast forwarding to a daily exercise, kind of routing, I mentioned almost 10 to 12 connections a day. What's great about that is, you know, the network is like a muscle and you got to keep working it out. You got to keep on exercising it. And every time you facilitate a connection, you know, those nodes of the network, there's something called Metcalfe's law back from my computer science days, get significantly stronger, exponentially stronger with every new node. And so when you're facilitating an introduction, you know, you're obviously working with a double opt-in, you're emailing somebody, say it's a executive at MasterCard that maybe I haven't spoken to in a year or so. And I say, hey, listen, it's been a long time. Here's an entrepreneur that wants to connect. Here's their value prop and their pitch. Are you interested? More than not, they are interested, you know, if something is relevant or if they're able to see any innovation, you know, to learn from, even if they're not going to necessarily work with that company immediately. That intro is probably 75%, 80% approved. And then I will connect, you know, facilitate the introduction between the entrepreneur, whoever it is, and that person. And so in this way, all nodes kind of, you warm up a node of the network that you haven't maybe talked to in a while, and you're facilitating a new relationship. And so that's the muscle that you're exercising kind of on a daily basis. But yeah, I was lucky to start with a baseline for my own startup endeavors, and then every day, kind of the network gets bigger and bigger.
No, that's amazing. And since you touched about network and access, venture capital is a relationship-based industry. So I would love to know your experience in investing in this amazing company, especially Uber, and what were your learnings?
Yeah, you know, some of the most interesting companies, for sure, not some, all, have incredible founders. That's what it all comes down to. And we remember as founders ourselves, businesses twist and turn and pivot. It's very rare that you finish a business at exit, IPO, M&A with the same business plan than when you started, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, we say, you know, you bet on the jockey, not the horse. And so in every one of these, you know, outcomes, billion-dollar plus businesses in particular, it's all about the founder. The founder is super unique. You know, 1 out of 8 billion, 7.8 billion people on the earth that can pull this off, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what it boils down to in every event. Yeah, you know, it's always super exciting to tell stories about some of these companies. Today, you know, this is something that's public. We announced a Series B in a company called Alloy, Alloy, and we led the seed about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And they raised a $40 million round. And
Congratulations.
I think it's a pretty significant achievement for this company. But back to the founding team, you know, 3 founders, Laura, Charles, and Tommy, actually met at a previous fintech company that had failed. We love founders that kind of have had their hands around each other's necks, but they still want to work together again. One thing we've learned is de-risking that founder infighting and optimizing founder chemistry is very important, right? And you know, they started this company. They actually started in 2015. We joined the journey in 2017, and they're off and running. But that's an example of, you know, founders that we really look for, serial founders that have either tasted failure or had a small taste of success, and they're more motivated. They have that muscle memory, as I mentioned, that we accumulated, and they have a chip on their shoulder, right? you look at some of the world's greatest entrepreneurs, like Elon Musk, like why is he continuing to innovate, right?
Yeah.
There's some chip on his shoulder. For those of you that watched, The Last Dance during the pandemic, Scottie Pippen was not the first pick in the first draft. And
Yeah.
every morning he wakes up motivated, thinking about the people that passed on him, right? Even after 6 rings. So what is that chip on your shoulder? What is that chip on the founder's shoulder that makes them so much more motivated than anybody else in that category? And so that's something that we look for. And that's a common thread between all of these successes.
That's great. And, as a sports VC, I love the sports analogy that you gave. And since we are talking about, the different kind of founders and the idiosyncrasies, I would love to know, many VCs during the Black Lives Matter movement, they offer to take steps to improve the lack of representation in their industry. So you had 103 meetings with Black founders through Super Peer. So what was your experience, and where do you think is the systemic problem when it comes to funding Black founders?
Sure. So yeah, after George Floyd, obviously the industry reacted, I think, very positively, and everybody tried to, open their eyes and create more awareness and opportunities for investments within the underrepresented founding community. One of the things we did immediately is, you mentioned we used a company called SuperPeer, one of our investments, to essentially do one-on-one coaching with underrepresented founders. The number now is in the hundreds, I think, probably over 300 across the firm, and still going. I still do about 10 a week.
That's great.
And one thing we've realized from all of these meetings now, it's been, since May, I guess almost 4 months, is that incredible founders, right, from all different types of communities, and the networks, their networks, specifically access to capital and knowledge networks, are completely fragmented, and they're not openly accessible.
Yeah.
And so it's so surprising. I'll jump on with a founder and they'll say, I'm trying to build this company. And then, you might have another analogy. Oh, it's like Stripe, or it's like Open Door, or it's like this. And oftentimes, they won't even recognize those names, right? And it's just like, you have to remember, we're in this very knowledgeable kind of niche in tech, and we're reading all the right news and we're talking to all the right people. And a lot of folks don't have that same access, right? And so just talking about those other companies, those other stories, those other analogies is helpful. But what's even more helpful is then connecting them to, here you go, you should meet the VP of product at Stripe, boom, right? And some of those conversations can literally change founders' trajectories dramatically. I remember as a founder, we met so many VCs that passed on my businesses, but the most impactful conversations were ones that, may have passed, but they still provided an introduction to somebody that changed the trajectory of my business, and I still remember, a handful of those opportunities in which that, those were facilitated. So anyway, that kind of inspired us. Can we democratize networks, specifically knowledge networks and capital networks? And so that's what we spend a lot of our time doing. And we just want founders to find their groove, find their niche in the universe. And we're lucky to if things are aligned and we can invest, and help them on their journey. But there's a lot of work before that investment can even happen, right?
Absolutely.
Getting your team together, building a product prototype. We're not pre-seed. Traditionally, we're seed. So we need a little bit of traction, and we're also a little bit more interested in technology moats than brand moats, but we want to be helpful regardless.
Yeah.
And so anyway, those are some of our learnings. And, we're going to continue doing this. Underrepresented founders in general at large, right? I mean, it was inspired by Black Lives Matter movement. A majority of these founders are Black, but now increasingly a lot more Latinx, BIPOC in general, and underrepresented, so a ton of female founders that we mentor as well.
That's great. And I think that that speaks volume. Did you get to invest in any of the Black founders?
So we got close, actually. Interestingly enough, the ones that were aligned in our sweet spot were very competitive, and so we ran hard at a lot of them. And in fact, we lost. We don't say this too often. We usually win most deals. We lost one. We've done a ton of investing earlier than Eniac
Mm-hmm.
as angels
Okay.
in a number of companies. A bunch of them are not public yet. Some of them you can find on my wife's website, reshmansajani.com, under the investment section. But yeah, we probably backed, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 dozen Black founders, personally through the fund. But we definitely would love to invest in a lot more underrepresented founders.
Yeah, that's great. Since we're talking about startups and performance, let's talk about startup performance data and the valuation around it. I mean, how do you analyze that during due diligence process? Because accessing startup performance data at early stage investment, it's not that easy, and even after you invest, it's not that easy. So I would love to know your take, how you build a relationship with the founders also to access the startup performance data.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is when we're investing, there's not, most of these businesses are pre-revenue, so there's
Yeah.
not a ton of data, right? But it depends. If it's a consumer business, there is some cohort data of users, whether it's DAU, MAU, 30, 60, 90-day churn, viral coefficient, things that you can get a glimmer, a
Yeah.
glimpse of how it's tracking. On the B2B side, we look to do customer discovery. By the way, our diligence process is, as I mentioned, in terms of the human Rolodex, like introducing founders to our network and seeing how they click. Right, that's important, very important for us. So if we're able to introduce them to a brand that they then sell, and the brand tells us that this is the next best thing to sliced bread, then it will pique our interest and help in diligence. But typically, we like to see a few customers, if not in post-production revenue generating mode, that at least has a design partner that we can actually reference.
Mm.
So that's some of the performance metrics that we look at. Now we're seed stage. There's a lot more data at the Series A after us, right? At that point, there's real MRR, there's real ARR, there's real, users, and churn, and NRR is a great metric, which is, speaks to churn, but it's actually net
Yeah.
retention rate. So, but typically you don't have a lot of that at seed.
Yeah. And how do you maintain the relationship later on in Series A, B, like you talked about Alloy, to make sure that the startup performance data maintains, and how does that work for you?
Yeah, so we only enter at seed, so we never enter at Series A. But businesses that we do invest in at seed, we usually have board seats in. Um, and so, we're privy to the data,
Yeah.
because we're on the board, at least quarterly, all the way, hopefully to IPO.
Now, since many of our audiences are LPs, I would love to touch base on this question on the LP liquidity, considering what is going on, the uncertainty in the market. How do you approach LP liquidity to your incoming LPs or to your existing LPs? Because some of them may be family offices or ultra high net worth individuals. And if they are looking for a liquidity, currently the market is definitely better, but if they were looking for a liquidity earlier this year, how did you approach that? And what's your take as a whole? Though venture capital is a very illiquid asset.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the nice thing about seed is that we have secondary opportunities all the time for our growth stage companies, right? Typically after the Series B, there's some sort of secondary opportunity where, that becomes a buy, hold, sell decision for us. We are about to participate in our first secondary. We've had a lot of opportunities. We're finally pulling the trigger on one, but that's where seed becomes a lot more liquid of an asset class than the later classes. When we're not if you're on the board and you sell, that's a bad sign. But we're usually coming off the board at the A or the B. And then so selling a little bit of the position afterwards is all good. And it's
Like
almost
that.
understood in the seed world. One lesson we've learned, though, is our best companies typically take 7 or 8 years to germinate. 7's like a magic number from seed. That's how long it takes to create unicorns. typically in this business. And so as an LP, you got to be very patient. Our first fund, we're really happy, we've tripled, but that was 10 years ago. It's still going, obviously, but it's already at 3x. And our subsequent funds, Eniac 2, 3, 4, we think are going to do even better. But it takes time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it takes time, and you being an emerging fund manager, I mean, you said Eniac is a startup. What do you look at the market for an emerging fund manager? I mean, currently, a lot of micro funds are becoming a new asset class. What's your take on the emerging fund manager? And I was actually recently talking to a lot of LPs, and they're thinking about the emerging fund manager program and saying that a smaller amount of checks are not enough to move the needle, but there has to be much more thing that needs to be done in this area.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just tweeted out recently, I think a lot of, actually this in response to the ban the chain smokers creating a venture capital fund, like a $34 million fund. I think it's very easy to become a VC. I think we saw this with all the super angels recently a few years ago that decided to create funds. It's much harder to stay a VC. I think a lot of folks can have a fund one, and maybe even a fund two based on just the hype and the buzz, right? Because it takes so long, right? 7 years for a unicorn, or even 3 or 4 years before your first exit, that you can raise a fund two on the back of a fund one just by buzz. But raising a fund three is really hard. I remember when we raised our fund three, which was our first institutional fund, it was backed by a top university endowment. Everybody said, you've made it. Like, that's a milestone in venture capital, right? Because to raise a fund three, that's an institutional LP fund, you need to definitely show performance in funds one and two, right? Yeah. You need to show not only TVPI, but DPI. You need to show returns. And you need to be top quartile too these days, right? It's so competitive and so saturated. We use Cambridge and Cambridge Associates as our benchmark data. And we're happy to say all our funds are top quartile, but I think that's the bar these days to raise a fund three. So easy to become a VC, hard to stay a VC. And by the way, I've only been doing, Eniac's only 10 years old. So I could be watching this on YouTube like 10 years from now, like kicking myself, like that was the beginning and the end of Eniac. But so far so good. We're launching Fund 5 next year. We haven't announced it yet, but it'll be a 2021 fund. And so far so good.
That's great. Congratulations on your Fund 5. Now, since we are talking about all this mix and venture capital and how it's a long-term game, and I always say that venture capital it's not a job, it's a lifestyle, and you have to be prepared for a lifestyle. So how do we acquire such learning habits like of being a VC? And I would love to know, how do you maintain your work-life balance? Because your wife is a successful entrepreneur, you have young children actually. So how are you managing work-life balance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, if you're aligned with your passion, then it's not work. It's not a 9-to-5 job. You're not checking in a punch card and waiting to run out of the office. I think every human, high level, from a philosophical perspective, spiritual perspective, should try to find what they absolutely love to do. And some people don't find it. Some people take their whole life searching for it. And again, I fell into it. I still don't like the word VC, but I fell into being able to back and help other entrepreneurs. And by the way, the capital piece of helping is a tiny fraction of the entire piece. But, I'm very lucky to be working with 3 buddies that I met 25 years ago as freshmen at University of Pennsylvania, right? So we were friends for 15 years before we started the fund. And if you love who you work with and you love what you do, it's not a job. So I think that parlays into your question on work-life balance. When it's not work, it's part of your life. And, this job, anybody knows, you get calls all hours of the night from founders, talking them off ledges, helping them, get their, press straightened out for the next day, fighting fires with them, whatever it takes. And so, I think you need to have that mindset. You need to absolutely love it. You need to love building businesses. yourself and you know, and helping others do that as well. Um, I think my wife feels the same way for what she's doing, you know, as well. She's very lucky to have found her passion after running for office twice, having found Gross Code, and you know, we're lucky, right, to be running our businesses and really focusing on what we love. So, you know, I think that's the heart of it, you know, in terms of work-life balance. I mean, we definitely try to shut off on the weekends. We definitely try to have forced vacations, right? Where we are actually had for the first time in years an out of office email notification at the end of August this year, and I said
Wow.
I'm recharging, and you know, I felt weird about it, but you know, after the fact, I thought it was great because it's not only for you, it's for other people. It's for
Yeah.
other people to understand and realize that you don't need to be on 24/7. And I think for founders and other, you know, anybody right in the ecosystem, um, hopefully was inspired. Like, okay, I want to do this too. You know, it's it's incredibly essential, especially post COVID, um, where people could literally work 24 hours a day,
Yeah.
right? Um, that you take a forced break, that you take forced breaks, and you know, you do other things. And so not just for our sanity, but also for our kids. As you mentioned, we have two young kids, 5-year-old and a 7-month-old. So that's always fun. Nights and weekends, you know, we try to be good parents. But but yeah, that's, you know, that's the heart of it. If you're focused on what you love doing, absolutely love doing, you think about it while you sleep, you're going to be, you know, hopefully the best at the world at it. Um, and and it doesn't feel like work.
Love that answer. Thanks a lot, Nihal. It was such a fun having you on GBC.
Great. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you, Nihal.